for showing up. Really appreciate this opportunity to be in conversation with everyone. For those of you who have been through any of the talks that I've given before, again, I'm honored by your investment of time, and I want you to see it as an investment, so I treat it that way. Also, for those who haven't been in sessions with me before, I hope that this resonates with you, but for me, I like things that are practical. These VMOs are by definition, I think, strategic in nature, but the biggest challenge that I see when I'm helping organizations roll them out is like kind of how do you get started, especially if you've got a small team and don't have a lot of resources in every sense of that word. So today is the second in a three-part series. We started off as one part, and it was just there was a lot to cover, and I wanted to do it justice so that folks really could come out of this after three of these sessions, being able to really get started. So not a whole lot of theory here, but we're going to jump right in, excuse me, and kickstart our Agile VMO. So this is part two. We covered in the first one, generative AI and VMO, why, and then what the first 90 days look like. And then we covered in detail some of the key elements that you can do in the first 30 days and how we use generative AI. Today, we're going to do a phase one recap. So for those who weren't there, or even just as a refresher, what did we cover? But it's going to be a little bit more than a recap, but I try to not steal my own thunder too much. So you'll see momentarily. And then we'll go into phase two. So the 31 through 60 days. What are some things that would be good in terms of order of operations to roll out our VMO? What are some things that we can do, and how can generative AI help us in those situations? And I'll go through some real world examples and some screen captures so that you can see the sorts of prompts that I'm using for the sorts of challenges or needs that I have and what the results were. So you can see those all real time. And then in our final session coming up next month, at that point, we'll then bring it all together and we'll do the final 30 days. And in that session, I'll also cover caveats and caution. I often say, get everyone really enthusiastic about doing this and tell you all of the ways that I think would be really helpful to get you kickstarted, then just kill that vibe. But joking aside, as we use these tools, and I think most everyone at this point has used generative AI tools, you know that they're great until they're not. And so knowing where that is and what to look for, I think is really important for this to be effective. So and then we'll close the last session with some additional concrete steps about moving forward. So with that, I threw my link in the chat. I'm connected, I know, with a number of you. I see some familiar faces. Hi. For those who are not, if you'd like to connect on LinkedIn, happy to do so. I'll go through my bio very quickly. I'm VP of Consulting here at LitheSpeed, speaker, and I like to see myself as an educator. That's very important to me in what I do. Dangerously close to 30 years in technology throughout all areas of the SDLC, PDLC. Around 6 of that was developing and deploying AI and natural language processing solutions. And that informs a lot of what I have talked about here today. Developed and delivered multiple AI-focused training courses as well. So I see AI as a valuable tool, not as a standalone, not overhyped, but just as a practical tool that we can weave into our work, especially with what we'll talk about today. I actively use generative AI many times on a daily basis to help me with efforts like this. And so, again, I have a generalized allergy to the overly theoretical. I want to know how tools can help me do what I need to do. And I believe that you hopefully are all here for that same reason. So we'll jump right in. So to recap a little bit from phase one was really about planning and preparing your VMO. Some of the things that we talked about specifically, 4 items for each of these 30-day periods. The first was engaging stakeholders, and we use generative AI to analyze their influence and to develop some automated communication campaigns for those different groups of stakeholders so that we could communicate most effectively to them about rolling out the VMO in a way that's targeted towards the needs, wants, concerns of those individuals. We talked about defining vision and objectives and using generative AI to help us facilitate strategic workshops for defining goals and OKRs and really understanding even more broadly the goals and objectives for our VMO. We talked about using generative AI to help us with initial value stream mapping, to look, whether you call it value stream mapping or whatever you call it, the idea of looking for bottlenecks in processes, being able to quantify those issues, looking for understanding of current state, and then how we can optimize that. So generative AI is helpful for us, as we talked about in the first 30 days, in terms of initiating that value stream mapping. And then tool selection to be able to manage migration from a PMO, a traditional PMO, to a VMO. Tools aren't the only thing, but they are really a foundational thing that needs to be in place, and we want tools that support a VMO effectively. So those were 4 things that we covered in our first session. So those of us, we're all well acquainted with agile ways of working. We want to inspect and adapt. That's core to the way that we work, not just our practices, but our principles. So before we get into 31 through 60, that the second phase, what are our follow-up actions from those first 4 key kickoff areas? So I wanted to talk about how to use generative AI iteratively, including to true back to the things we talked about in the first session. And the first one is to reassess engagement. So let's consider validating whether our stakeholder engagement efforts for those first 30 days were effective and adjust as needed. I think our initial approach on this, and generative AI helped us, that was great. But again, we want to examine those results. And there's a high likelihood that whatever we did, regardless of how good that was, we could benefit from tuning that, from tweaking it. So inspect and adapt, right? So it's some recommended actions that we could do with the help of generative AI to help make sure that that first phase was effective. We could use generative AI to analyze stakeholder meeting notes, emails, and survey responses to identify engagement levels and sentiment. Now, some of those may be self-evident from the conversations that we've had, but what a great way to take those different artifacts that happened as a result of what we talked about in the first 30 days and really see overall, do we have some patterns that may emerge that we may want to look into to tune how we're approaching the communication and how we're working with stakeholders. Refine the stakeholder profiles. So grouping stakeholders by influence, alignment, and involvement. Again, generative AI can help us in that area as well. Updating our engagement plans. So with agile ways of working, we're still going to create plans. We want, though, like with everything else we do in agile ways of working, to be iterative, to reflect, to inspect and adapt. We should be updating our engagement plans. What isn't working as well as we would like it to, now that we actually have some real world data coming back to us? Adjust those communication methods. Maybe we need meetings more frequently. Maybe we need them less frequently. Maybe we need a different meeting, or to split a meeting into different meetings based on stakeholders, or whatever that case may be. But generative AI can help us to update those engagement plans, especially after we refine those stakeholders and sort of understood what has bubbled up in the conversation since. Actionable prompt example, just one, and we'll, again, like we did with the last one, we'll share this out for everyone so you'll have the prompts available. But this prompt that you can use: analyze meeting transcripts and survey responses to determine which stakeholder groups are underengaged or misaligned with the Agile VMO goals. What else might we want to do as a follow-up from those first 30 days? The next is to review vision and OKRs. We want to make sure that the vision and those objectives and key results are still aligned with strategic objectives and clearly understood across the organization. Now, you may think, and I certainly would, I don't think that our strategy should be changing every month. That would be mildly terrifying, except the mildly part. But that said, again, we're inspecting and adapting. So whatever that is at that point, especially if OKRs are new to the organization, as information emerges, as people become more engaged, it's a good opportunity to make little pivots or big pivots as we need to refine what we're doing based on the real world interactions that we now have from those first 30 days. So here are some things that we can do with generative AI support. Assess the OKRs for clarity and consistency. So review those existing OKRs for ambiguity, duplication, or misalignment, especially as cross-referenced with other information that you're getting in those first 30 days. Facilitate OKR refinement workshops. So if we do see that there's a benefit in refining those OKRs, maybe we were overly optimistic about what we can do in a given quarter for a given objective and those key results, whatever the case may be, it's a good opportunity to true back to that and to make sure that we're putting those goals via OKRs things that are viable, that are possible to actually accomplish in that time frame. I find when I work with organizations on OKRs, they tend to be either far too broadly ranging or way too optimistic based on current state to be able to achieve those results. It's a good opportunity before you have that as a final target to assess it and to make sure that it is achievable and realistic. Align with strategy. So again, as we have more information that's coming up, not that our strategy has changed, but maybe what we know and understand about that strategy perhaps has in the last 30 days, use generative AI to reassess how those current OKRs support overall organizational strategy and adjust if needed. And here's another actionable prompt example. Review the current OKRs and suggest refinements to ensure they are outcome driven and aligned with strategic things. We talked about initiating the value stream mapping. So now that we're past our first 30 days, let's confirm that those initial mapping efforts are accurate and that actionable insights have been produced. So we can quantify some early process metrics. We can take some workflow data from whatever tool you're using. I've used Jira, but ADO and other tools, all of its ilk, will do the same thing where you can export this information. Some of these tools now have some of this analysis even built in, but if we want a path that we know works, we can export that information and provide the right context to the generative AI tool in question to make sure that we're surfacing bottlenecks and flow efficiencies now that we've got some data there that we can analyze. Generating the executive summaries. So as we start looking for these opportunities with our value stream and some of the challenges or opportunities that we have, we can use generative AI to help us generate executive summaries to put those findings into far less minutia, far less detail, things that can be an executive summary that anybody on the business side, on the executive side, can read and understand without further context. That's going to be essential for these sorts of changes that we're going to be making. Identify optimization opportunities. So use generative AI to map detected issues to known process anti-patterns and suggest mitigations. I look often at the waiting for states: ready for analysis, ready for development, ready for deployment, ready for testing, ready for UAT, etc. Those are the sorts of things that I look for. Using these tools can help me quantify and identify not only where we have challenges, but some well-identified ways to mitigate most of those. Again, generative AI is built on data that is available from all sorts of different sources on the internet. Where there's lots of data, the quality of the responses, from my experience, has been far better. This is one of those areas that there's a lot of good data out on the interwebs, and that will really help with generative AI tools, whichever one you choose, in giving you useful, actionable guidance based on the data that you've provided. Here's one prompt that you can consider using. Analyze value stream data from workflow tools and identify the top 3 bottlenecks impacting delivery flow. So again, get an export from a system in whatever format you can, combined with this prompt and some additional context, and you'll have some good insights on some things that you might want to consider. And then the last of those 4 from the first session, evaluate tooling process. So again, tools, many organizations start and end with tools. If we're on Jira, we're Agile, etc. That meme is well worn over on LinkedIn. But the reality is that tools are essential for us to do what we're doing at the team level. They're absolutely required from my perspective and experience. At the portfolio, at the VMO level, we really need good tools and we need to use them appropriately. So after those first 30 days, ensure the selected tools are aligned to the goals and that they are being laid as appropriate groundwork for and configured properly for use in the next phase. So some things that you can do: confirm the tool goal alignment. So if you haven't already done this, use generative AI to compare those tools against the functional needs that were defined. Make sure that all of those functionalities that you've defined in the tool, if you've chosen that tool, or if you're using a tool that you already have and you've identified that it can support those needs, make sure that you're using it to configure it properly so that you can effectively do things like show flow visually, or show that it's not flowing in many cases, what to do about it. Have portfolio level dashboards, so aggregate the information across multiple products or projects, etc. And then for lean budgeting. So now is a really good time, once the tool is in place, to start really exercising it for some of those true VMO functions. Also for initial use cases. So If we want to make sure that we're onboarding different teams, I'm actively doing this today. And as part of that work, when I need to get business executives up to speed on how to use a particular tool, and then technical experts on how to use that same tool, the communication and the training that I do is materially different based on the audience, their needs, all of that context. If you're not well acquainted, and even if you are, to simplify and save you some time, GenAI can help you with drafting role-specific tool scenarios so that you can help onboard those different personas, those different groups, in a way that's tailored specifically to what they want, what they need, how they communicate, and their context. So that's really valuable for engagement. It also will save you a lot of time. And here's an actionable prompt example you could use based on our selected tool and the Agile VMO goals defined in our OKRs. Generate an implementation readiness checklist and top three onboarding use cases. So these are things that you can use to get that ball rolling, or if it's rolling, to get it rolling faster and in the right direction. So that's a recap of our first 30 days. I hope that that was helpful for everybody. We're going to jump right into now the next 30 days and building upon that. So in phase 2, days 31 through 60, roughly, we want to form teams. And here's where generative AI can analyze team skill sets and provide some recommendations on training, programs, certifications, or anything else that might be valuable. Set up LPM, or lean portfolio management. So you can use generative AI to help simulate prioritization scenarios based on real-time data inputs, or other things that may be useful and usable in terms of data that we can use to really tailor this towards our organization, our teams, our context. Designer governance framework. So what I find in many cases, well, about 100% of those who are moving from a PMO to a VMO, hence the book that Sanjeev from LitheSpeed wrote that informs so much of this. When we're moving from one form of governance to a new form of governance, we need to make sure that we are addressing those governance needs properly, even if we're doing it through different vehicles, and that's very important. So we're moving from an old form of governance to new, but there's still governance. We need to design that governance framework, and we want to be thoughtful about how we do that transition, and GenAI can help. And then plan for our first big room planning, or PI planning, or mid-range planning, or whatever term you use. So those are the 4 things that we'll be talking about for the remainder of today's session. The first is forming teams. And again, I'm using the custom GPT that Sanjeev and LitheSpeed built, and it's available in OpenAI's ChatGPT store. Agile VMO Copilot is the name, but that's what I'm using for most of my examples, because it is tuned with some authoritative guidance that really helps establish what we believe to be a VMO. And then if you look beyond in just general GenAI tools, you may find some other references that may be in conflict with some of the principles or practices that we find standard. So again, your mileage may vary. You can use whatever tool you'd like, but my examples are specifically based on using the custom GPT for the VMO, Agile VMO Copilot. So as the VMO has new roles and teams transitioning from legacy ways of working, we are going to have new and modified roles. We are always moving from something to the VMO, and we want to be thoughtful about current state and how we approach that thoughtfully. GenAI can be really helpful to analyze team skill sets and provide recommended training programs or certifications. It also can help identify which legacy roles might map best to new organizational roles. And it will also, I don't have this in the bullet points here, but it will also help you understand if you just simply have new roles that you may not have a good person to fill on that. And then some of those roles can be contractors, consultants, some of them you may want to hire or promote from within, whatever that case may be. But GenAI can really help with some of that. And again, the more data that you provide to it, the better it's going to be for you. So you can see in my example, act as an HR strategist. So I'm putting on that persona hat about who I want the tool to be. Analyze the required skill sets for a VMO team, identify gaps in my current team, and suggest training or hiring strategies to fill those gaps. So again, with prompts, the more detail and context and specificity, the better. I think that's an overarching rule that is useful in any use of these tools. Context is king or queen. It is absolutely essential. So with this in the response, It talks about the core skill sets for a VMO team. Now, in this example, I didn't provide it a current org chart. If I had, it would be even more useful. So based on this, it gave me a generic response. And you can see, although the generic response is still useful, but it tells me in this interaction here, to help you best, I need to know current roles and capabilities on your team, your organizational context, and the level of maturity. Those are great questions that will absolutely inform what a staffing plan would be. So I really like this. Again, I just asked it to help. It gave me some additional things that would help me to help it perform better, a la Jerry Maguire, for anyone who remembers the help me to help you meme. But it's really, it provided me what I asked for, but it actually gave me what I needed and I didn't ask for, which is what should I do to actually make this more meaningful and effective? So it gave me a generic scenario and some recommendations, and traditional current state and the traditional gaps that result. So that's useful. What could be from those examples, you can see it then gives me some recommended strategies. So upskilling and internal development is giving me concrete ideas. Now, again, I'm not going to run with all of these, but it's going to give me some ideas that I either will take action with a subset of them as they are. In most cases, though, I'm likely to look at some of these and go, that's close enough, and now I want to do X, Y, or Z. But it's giving me some good data to work with, whether or not I do all of those things, I do something different, a hybrid, whatever the case may be. I do now immediately have some actionable, useful information. Follows on with hiring strategy and cultural change initiatives. So I found this to be a really useful, usable response to a fairly basic question about what I needed to do and how I could approach doing that in really practical, tactical, usable terms. So I found that to be incredibly important. And what it provided, I asked for a synthetic example, but when you put your org chart in, if you've got one, that you can add, you'll get specifics with specific individual names and rationale. You may not agree with all of it. When I've done this in some cases, I would say 10 to 20% was just completely misaligned. Don't know why. Most of it was great. So you still have to analyze what you're getting back. And that is also a cautionary tale, is always look at the results that you're getting. But I found this to be incredibly helpful for me. And I do this for a living. And I still found this was a great way to say, these are the roles. Here's where you might consider sourcing it. If you've got people who are there today, here's how this might map. And here's the rationale for why. So it's even giving me some thinking or talking points in the rationale about why I made that decision. And then it gives me some follow-up actions. So develop role charters for each VMO position, set up a learning backlog for upskilling, pair consultants with internal staff to ensure knowledge transfer and continuity. Again, this is what I do for my day job. These are things that I do and I would do. I think this is great advice, and I think it's quite comprehensive and very much actionable. Everything on here is not theoretical. These are all things that I could create JIRAs for and put them in my backlog. So that's how we can get started forming teams with little to no context and just an org chart and the right prompts, get you going in a good way. The next, how about setting up lean portfolio management, LPM? That's even for those who are acquainted with LPM, this can be really challenging, especially for organizations that have managed through traditional PMOs, which is really the scope of what most of us are talking about. We're moving from generally one big monolith that is overly heavy in processes and practices and gates and those sorts of things to something that is, in its name, the first word is lean. How do we change? That's a material change for most organizations. So how can we get Gen AI to help us? Well, one of the things is to implement prioritization frameworks. We use WSGIF, but you can also use Gen AI, and I'll show you some examples of both of them, to simulate prioritization scenarios based on real-time data. So this is one of those areas, again, that I find is very challenging in the real world, in the wild, for most organizations to get started with LPM. It's tough for everybody. It's tough culturally. It's tough based on tradition. It's tough based on roles and responsibilities in traditional PMOs and traditional organizational structures. So this one can be tough. So let's go ahead and get started. How can Gen AI help us? Well, in this particular example, I had some sample MVPs or MMPs. I asked to have it help with LizGIF. Thank you for the kind note in the comments, but I've asked it for help with WizGIF, and it provides first a recap for LPM context. Now, if I was already familiar with that in my prompts, I could avoid that and just say I'm well acquainted with this. Let's just go ahead and get started. But this assumes that I don't have that context. So it shows me what WizGIF is, how it's calculated, and then it's going to help me actually roll forward with using WizGIF. So in this particular instance, I provided some sample MVPs, MMPs. It's scored differently than I would. So one of the first things I saw here, not right or wrong, but I use Fibonacci when I use WizGIF. That's how I've always done it. It just did a scale from 1 to 10. Your mileage may vary. I don't know that it has material differences for folks. But again, I like this example. And in this particular instance, even though it used a slightly different scoring approach than I would, you can see that it took a stab at, based on the context I provided, the features that were now broken into MVPs or MMPs, and it tried to attach the different WSJF factors to calculate what that would be. Now, in the real world, I wouldn't be comfortable having a tool do all of the WSJF scoring for me, but I think I could certainly do something like where I can use as again a co-pilot, that word that keeps coming up. I can use WSJF to help me if I don't, for example, understand the market conditions that should inform things like time criticality. That is a scenario where generative AI can really help because I don't have that as a background. Like market research for me is not one of those things that I'm an expert on. So these tools can be really helpful in those areas to augment this process. And you can see based on what it provided here, prioritization results from WSJF, it did the calculation, and then it provided a summary from highest to lowest in terms of WSJF and what that final score would be. So what we would presumably be working on first, second, third, etc. But what I wanted to show in a little bit more detail, and I had just mentioned, is the LPM level insight. So you can use this WSJF ranking. So again, it's providing this narrative for those of you who may not be familiar with LPM and not just how it does the calculation through WSJF and what LPM is, but these ideas about funding and capacity allocation, the rest about how LPM works. It provides those insights and weaves in how we use WSJF to do those key essential elements of lean portfolio management. And then it provides in the bottom left-hand side of the screen, those GenAI acceleration opportunities. So automated scoring recommendations by analyzing customer sentiment, business OKRs, or compliance deadlines. So again, that's a great use case or scenario. If I have new OKRs and I want the true back to in terms of the relative priority, providing those OKRs as additional context to do the WSJF calculations could be incredibly valuable because the OKRs are going to say what we need to get done in the next quarter, et cetera, or in a given quarter. And that will help inform things like time criticality and the WSJF calculation. It is a very essential element of that factor. And then scenario modeling, which is something that I've just started doing with it, and I find it really valuable. And I had alluded to this in the prior slide, so I want to talk through it a little bit. So I asked for help with scenario modeling. So this is a way that we can look at different scenarios based on overarching demands. So maybe they're in the OKRs, maybe they're not, maybe it's not clear enough. But maybe I have a scenario where time to market is a compelling driver for me. That's going to inform time criticality. If I have other scenarios where market acceleration is not an issue, but quality is one, for those same features, the WSJF calculations by definition should be different. But this gives me the ability to go through different scenarios. And I would just say, although you don't see it in the example here, if there are particular scenarios you wanted to contemplate, define those scenarios. So you could just change that prompt to say, I'd like some assistance with scenario modeling. The scenarios that I would like you to model specifically are time to market is essential. Addressing low customer service satisfaction numbers is a different scenario. Market size, the number of net new users, whatever those scenarios are. Again, primarily from a business perspective, what's the driver? Do we want more revenue? Do we want to retain more revenue? Do we want more customers? Whatever those things might be, if you have those as scenarios, let it go through different versions of your WSJF calculations based on that as a starting point. So I found that to be a surprise, but very valuable way to look at different scenarios and provide some initial calculations. And so you can see on this now, I like what it did here. I also, as is my tradition, will also kind of kill the vibe a little bit. So I really, I like this tool also for many legacy PMOs, traditional PMOs, have project charters and multi-year projects, initiatives. One of the things that I found is if it's done well and you iterate a lot, you can take those large capital projects, or maybe they're even operational, but multi-year, very complex phase gate type projects, and provide that as context and say, break this into epics and MMPs, MMFs. And you can see what it did here. So when I provided this large capital project, it broke them into different pieces, provided an estimated duration. And whether or not I agree with exactly how it broke it out, same as what I'd said on that prior slide, it's a really good starting point, even if it is not my final point. The areas that I would caution against, just I think it's probably dangerous, or at least you'd want to double check the numbers. I would not copy and paste this verbatim without doing some additional validation in whatever way is appropriate. So for certain things like core and HR integration, maybe that is a fairly standard thing for most organizations. But I would be concerned about putting anything in writing that would go to people to think that it's 4 months and 800K. Those are things that I don't know that I would include, but they're interesting for me to look at and say, okay, this may be a good starting point, but I would just, again, strongly caution against just copying and pasting anything involving financial calculations. And for commoditized stuff, time estimates aren't that big of a deal, I think, in most cases. But if you send something out just like this, it may be looked at by the folks that are receiving it, especially if they're on the finance or executive side, as a commitment or as a budgeting mechanism. So I would suggest using this for your own internal analysis and then doing some work on top of that before you use this data. But again, if it gets you 50 to 80% of the way there, that's a great time saver. And it's leveraging data that's available in this model based on probability, which means that it's likely, yes, it's a conversation starter. I agree. Hopefully it's not a conversation ender. But I do think it's also good. One of the benefits of using these tools, if you can triangulate in the best sense of that word, being able to show that your estimates are actually derived from common standard estimates that are coming from other implementations that are similar, also gives a lot of credibility to time and cost and staffing estimates. So I find there's value there. I just, again, would caution against just copying and pasting. I've seen too many people just taking the output of these tools and just plopping them in an email, and just, it's a good start, but it's not the end. So some more detail that it provided on this, I just wanted to show what I really have appreciated, again, with the right iterating and the right prompts. It gave me those minimum marketable features. It gave me them enumerated. It gave me the WSJF breakdown, and then it gave me the follow-up actions. And I really like having especially if you're just getting started with your VMO, this idea of, we've got the portfolio Kanban for LPM. We need to make sure that we're limiting WIP. So we're only going to advance the top 2 epics to analyzing, those sorts of things. It's baked into its answer. So I find that to be very helpful, especially for those of us who are just getting started. So 2.3, design and refine the governance framework. Again, this is one of the biggest areas that I've seen that can be challenging, maybe up to there, up close to, but not exactly as big as changing the financial and funding structure. But the governance framework and moving away from something that, even if people didn't like it, they were comfortable with it. The traditional PMO generally don't have a lot of cheerleaders that I've heard that love the PMO and what PMOs do. And for those of you that have PMOs that are beloved, forgive me, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about all the other PMOs. That said, there's a reason why most PMOs have a bit of a bad rap, because the governance is very, 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 very heavy and cumbersome, to the point that people don't always even know what the needs are for compliance for projects. So we need to move away from that, but we're not moving towards the wild, wild west. we're moving towards a new way of governance, and that's what our VMO includes. It's a new way to have adaptive governance, but we need to establish what that means, especially when we're moving from an existing functional construct to something that's new. So we want to have adaptive governance policies that integrate compliance, risk management, and include transparency. So this is an area, again, because there's a lot of data in these models about traditional PMOs and also the VMO now and agile ways of working. You can use generative AI to help draft governance policies tailored to best practices and your unique organizational context. So you can see my prompt here. Act as a governance consultant, design an adaptive governance framework for managing compliance, risk, and decision-making processes in the VML rollout. Incorporate policies tailored to, and I left the square brackets in there because you can and should, again, provide as much context as possible. Most of my work experience is for now going dangerously close to 30 years is in financial services with a little bit of AI, but even with that, supporting a lot of financial services organizations. So I know that if I'm moving towards a new governance framework and a new approach for governance, I have to be especially careful. The number of compliance obligations, I also spend a lot of time financial services and insurance. We have HIPAA as well as PCI, PII, SOX, all of the other alphabet soup in terms of different areas that were formally required for compliance, and making sure that we're doing the right information. So if you're in a highly regulated area and you need to control how things get approved, what information is shared, those sorts of things, make sure that that context is provided here. In this example, you can see in a regulated environment. So that is where we want to go. Now, if I'm in a startup and that's less of a concern, provide that context and you'll get context appropriate responses. In this one, though, I do want a regulated environments because most of us are going to be subject to at least some of these. So again, you can see the brackets under purpose, insert industry regulations. So GDPR, if you do business in California, CCPA, Europe, GDPR, you see HIPAA there, all of the other alphabet soup. Provide whatever ones you know that you need to comply with, ISO standards as well, whatever that might be, provide those, and it can help to make sure that it's mapping appropriately to every control that's required in those regulations. You can use and I would suggest you should use your current state, use your current state and then use generative AI to do that governance mapping and really look at, where are those practices that you have today? Whatever information you have, the more context, again, the better, to map those processes and practices to the VMO. And so you can see, and this is a fairly, again, generic example, but the more details that you provide, the more specific your responses will be. But you can look here in this response mapping. So we don't want to just say we're moving from, PMO to VMO. What does that really mean? So these are some specific controls that you can see and how we've mapped current state controls like annual budget approval to rolling quarterly funding. So when we have folks, and these could be auditors as well, that want to understand the new way that you are governing this work. If you are subject to audits, and I have been in most of the places that I've worked for the last couple of decades, you want to be able to, as you make these changes, prove to the auditors that your governance checkpoints are in place. Most audits, at least from my experience, they're less concerned about how you've done it or what system you've used. What they want is proof of individual instances of how you managed a governance control that was required from that particular compliance need, that particular standard, whatever that might be, NIST, CCPA, whatever that might be. So this is a way to show stage gate reviews. Now we have this approval. It happened in a portfolio sync rather than a stage gate, or I'm looking at the data that's in JIRA. Whatever that is, though, how helpful would this be during an audit, or to work with your risk management team if they're the ones who are going to go through the audit, to say, as we're moving towards this new construct, this new approach for governance, we changed the way that we did this, but we didn't get rid of the intent, this governance intent in our control, and give these specific artifacts these specific examples. All of this data will be available in those proposed VMO controls and the governance mechanism and who owns that. So you can preempt a lot of concerns about that migration if you can provide this sort of information internally, work through who are those responsible individuals, and then have and document your new governance in a way that works for auditors and works for your teams at the same time. That's really what the VMO is about, is still having governance, but governance that works and works as lightweight as possible so people can focus on getting the actual work done and value delivered. As with the other, I really love and I didn't ask for this, I love that it presents this for me, follow-up actions. So the follow-up actions include co-creating governance guardrails with finance, compliance, and delivery leaders. Absolutely. Define escalation pathways that align with adaptive governance. So if things do go wrong, or when they do, in any sort of scale, something's going to go wrong sooner or later. What are the pathways for that? And then this last example, which I think applies for everything we're talking about here where possible, pilot this. Pilot it with a couple of epics before we start scaling. So we don't want to just try to do a big bang. The operative word in big bang is bang, and we want to avoid that. So try it with a couple of epics before scaling, and then evolve and iterate once you've gone through those. Here's some other details, again, from this ongoing chain of interaction. I spared you some of the prompts, but I wanted to show the depth and the breadth of the responses for this so that it's really meaningful. It's not just a chatbot with a simple response back. There's multiple iterations and pages, if you had printed this out, worth of dialogue. So some key processes. So for compliance management, some very useful specifics. Before there was GenAI, these were the things that I was talking with teams about. Here's how you can do it. So embed compliance acceptance criteria and epics or features. That is a well-established way to address this. A lot of organizations don't do it, but that is the way that we still have governance at the epic level, and in some cases, even at the story level. Great advice. Continuous compliance validation during increment reviews. So again, rather than adding additional structure, which is part of where traditional PMOs have had some challenges because it's overhead, but weave it into increment reviews and make sure that compliance is part of that process rather than an add-on bolt-on process. Maintain audit trails via tool chain integrations. I've been, I don't know if I'm making auditors happy, but I've used Jira audit trail, the Jira history for audit trails when I've had external auditors come in from various regulatory bodies that were doing audits. They've been more than happy with me being able to pull up a Jira issue and show all of the history, who did what, who approved it, when, where, etc. So use what you can to have that as auditable as part of compliance management. But that's another, again, great piece of practical, tactical, usable advice that the tool provided. Risk management provides some other ideas and how we can actively preempt issues. And when we can't actually preempt all of them, what do we do? How do we manage escalation? Those are really essential things that we want to know in advance for our new VMO. How do we handle the exceptions? And then the decision-making framework. So clarity about, again, it's governance, but we want it to be lightweight. We want everything that we do from the VMO to add clear value. So how do we do that in a thoughtful but practical and meaningful way? So the decision-making framework is part of that. And then even further, it gives me some example policies. So again, I wouldn't just copy and paste these, but it's a great starting point. You can iterate through the tool, or you can iterate solo after you have these starting points, whatever works best for the way you work. But I love this idea of compliance integration policy. So all initiatives must map regulatory controls to backlog items, and it has some of the potential controls that this particular instance would be required to comply to. Non-compliance items require mitigation plans approved by a risk and compliance advisory group. So again, what's the exception? What is the not corner case, but what is an alternate case or a negative case? It's baked those in, and some other examples of policies. It's even provided in item 5 some decision-making thresholds. Now, your organization may have these established already, so you may need to tweak them, but still, it's a great starting point, whether you're starting from scratch or evolving something you have. Who gets to make what decisions based on both dollar threshold, but also other criteria. Some of the organizations I work with have additional criteria, not just dollars, but what goes through the process if it's not directly and clearly aligned to one of the institutional or organizational needs. So bake that into your process based on your organization's context. And I would also just say, think about things that have been problematic to date and maybe zoom in on those and say, maybe we need a little bit more governance or structure here. Provide that context to your GenAI tool. Hey, this has really been an issue with getting formal sign off at the business stakeholder level, and it can give you some ideas on how to manage that particular challenge in the context of your VMO and your governance framework. So weave it into there, but make this a very interactive process to get the best results for what your specific governance framework is. Not John's, not anybody else's, but for your organization, your context. Make it unique to you so that it's really surgically oriented towards the needs that you have and doesn't have any additional things on top of that that you don't need that'll just weigh you down. And then finally, plan for big room planning. So you're an Agile facilitator. Note that I'm changing the personas in each of these instances to be specific to the context. You're an Agile facilitator preparing for a big room planning session involving stakeholders from finance, actuarial, claims, etc. For my insurance days, create a detailed agenda that includes prioritization exercises, dependency mapping activities, and follow-up tasks to ensure alignment across value teams. So again, super long run-on sentence, as is my standard, not just for these sessions and not just for prompts, but in general. In this case, though, that's a feature, not a bug, because that detail and that context is going to get me a better answer, and you can see here. So I really like the idea of using this for planning those initial sessions. I like it, even though it's not something, sorry for the double negative, I certainly can create meeting agendas and summarize discussions. It'd be really nice to not have to do that and to have tools do most of that heavy lifting so I can be present and focus my time on things that GenAI can't do. In this particular instance, it provided an agenda here, a pretty standard one, vision and strategic themes after the welcome and opening remarks, the value stream breakouts, the business context deep dives, etc. Now, if my environment, the teams involved, whatever that case may be, is different, if the context is different, provide that different context in your prompts and you'll get an agenda that's really specific for that. One of the things, again, that I liked, and the more that these tools are becoming more conversational, is after it provides the response, it does a pretty good job, at least in these cases, of suggesting some things that I didn't ask for that could be really helpful. In this one, it asks if I want a visual program board template or a facilitation guide. I have both. I really don't need the template. Tools like Miro, Mural, and its ilk do that just fine, and there's way too many options to choose from. But hey, a facilitation guide, I can facilitate, but I want it to give it to some of those within my client teams to facilitate these sessions. So this is a great way to get folks up to speed who haven't done it before in terms of how they can be effective facilitators of these sessions. So didn't ask for it. Love the fact that it asked me if that was something that I wanted. And in this case, I didn't even think to ask, but I'm happy that it asked me and I said yes. It helps me also, though, I can use it for talking points. So if I need to have some talking points for a particular epic or a particular strategy, not everyone is comfortable doing that. I've been doing it for so long that it doesn't bother me and it's sort of intuitive, but a lot of people haven't had to take big chunks of projects or initiatives and figure out talking points, especially if we're technical people thinking about it in a business context, whatever that may be. GenAI can really help. It can also help with identifying dependencies and help with communications, especially for the first big room planning. For those of you who've been through this at least once, you know that the first thing is you can't really expect me to take 2 days completely off of my calendar to do planning. That's not ever going to happen. There's ways to preempt that and any of the other common concerns that we have. Again, because this is a common practice across Agile teams at scale in many instances, the model itself has a lot of good data about what issues people raise in these sessions and therefore how to preempt that. What are techniques communication-wise or other strategies to preempt that issue and let people know that we're going to avoid those challenges.